All right. Um, so I want to talk to you a little bit about study skills. Now that we've talked about growth mindset and we did a little time management activity, the next thing I think for us to mention would be study skills. So, so let's get into it. So first of all, we're going to talk a little bit about memory. The brain turns information into knowledge by putting that information through several stages. The first stage is sensory memory. This is basically when you notice something, either because you felt it, or you heard it, or you smelled it, or whatever, right? When you decide to pay attention to something that's coming into your sensory memory, then that thing enters what's called your working memory. Now, working memory can only hold about 4 concepts at a time. And as soon as you stop thinking about whatever it is that you're thinking about in your working memory, then it sort of disappears, unless you can make it into a long-term memory. Long-term memory, or information moves into your long-term memory only after you've introduced it into your working memory on several occasions and over an extended period of time. And so that's when something enters your long-term memory. And once it's entered your long-term memory, it can, that information can fade a little bit over time, but it's pretty much going to be there in your long-term memory. So that's how memory works. So let's talk about how that relates to learning, okay? Because sometimes just getting the information into your working memory is enough, right? For certain classes, all you have to do is just have a few facts sort of in your mind, and you can just use your working memory to sort of keep them there, and that's enough for you to pass the class or whatever. That's usually not the case in math. In math, you usually have to get the information into your long-term memory. In other words, you actually have to learn the material in order to pass the class. And the reason for this is because working memory processes facts, whereas long-term memory is required to understand concepts. And this is important in math because math has a lot of concepts in it. There actually are not a lot of facts you have to learn in math. There are some facts, but it's mostly about conceptual understanding. And so, to give you an example of the difference, knowing the name of a bone is a fact, whereas understanding what that bone does in your body, that's a concept. And in order to learn concepts, in order to understand concepts, the facts have to already be in your long-term memory because, again, your working memory can only hold on to about 4 things at a time. And so if you have a concept that you're trying to understand, then that might require you to piece together 4 or 5 different facts, and so you would have to be able to hold on to 4 or 5 different facts while at the same time still have enough sort of processing power in your brain to piece them together in order to understand the concept. And that's just not going to happen because you don't have that much space in your working memory. So you have to have the facts already in your long-term memory so that your working memory can then piece those facts together in order to understand concepts. And that's where learning happens, especially with mathematics. So how do we get the mathematics into our long-term memory? How do we get those facts into our long-term memory? And then once we have the facts in our long-term memory, how do we turn those facts into concepts that we understand? So so that's the question, right? To do well in math, we have to get the information into our long-term memory. To get the information in our long-term memory, we need to introduce that information into our working memory on several occasions and over an extended period of time. The main way you do this in mathematics is by staying on top of your homework assignments. And that means that you can't just wait until the day before the test to do your homework assignments, right? You have to put in effort on a continual basis, right? You have to do some effort each day, or if that's not possible, then as often as possible, in order to get the information into your long-term memory. So stay on top of your homework. Now that's easy to say. It's a little bit more difficult to do. How do you make yourself do homework when you're not really feeling motivated to do it? And then the other thing is that I want to talk about is what techniques should you be using when you are doing your homework? So I want to discuss 4 things that I think might help you in these regards. So we're going to talk about your study environment, we're going to talk about something called the Pomodoro Technique, and then we'll talk about active recall and spaced repetition. So let's talk about each of those things. So as far as your environment is concerned, you need to try to find a space that you can set aside only for studying. It doesn't have to be an entire room, but for example, if you're going to be studying in your bedroom, then if you have space for a desk, then I would put a desk there in your bedroom. And at your desk, you should only study, right? You shouldn't do anything else at your desk. All you do at the desk is study for school. Now, some of you might not have that option, right? So if you don't have a space in your living environment that you can set aside only for studying, then my advice would be try to use some of the resources on campus at COS. Use the library, right? Get a study space in the library going. Use the math lab, right? You can go to the math lab and do your studying there at the math lab. Okay, but the idea is that you want to find a space that you can set aside only for studying, and as you're doing this, try to consider where you're going to study, but also when you're going to study. We've done a little practice with that with the study schedules that we've done, but consider when you're going to study and with whom you're going to study. Some people do a lot better if they're working in groups, and if that's you, then find a study group too. But the main thing I want to focus on right now is consider where you're going to study and try to find a space that you can set aside where the only thing you do in that space is study. Okay? And then what you want to do is you want to prepare your space for intense focus. That means you need to put away anything that's going to distract you. Your cell phones, for example. Don't have your phones out. In fact, not only don't have them out, but don't have them on. Silence them. Okay? You don't want something that's going to distract you by buzzing at you every 3 or 4 minutes, right? You want to put all that stuff away. Don't try to multitask. Put away anything unrelated to the task at hand, okay? And prepare yourself for some intense focus. There are several benefits as to why you would want to do this. First of all, it helps you to overcome procrastination, because if your study environment, or if the environment that you're in only points to a single activity, then you're going to be much more likely to do that activity when you're in that environment, right? So if you have a space that's set aside where the only thing you ever do in that space is study, then as soon as you sit down in that space, you're going to be in study mode, right? And so to help you to overcome procrastination, another benefit to controlling your study environment is that it's been shown that on a test, if you're feeling a lot of anxiety, if you can take a moment to kind of close your eyes and visualize yourself in your study space, then that can help you to recall things that you are kind of blanking out on during your test. That only works if you have a study space, right? So you've got to have a study space so that you can visualize yourself in that space if you find yourself blanking out in the middle of a test. And then thirdly, it helps you to achieve the focus that you need in order to move the information from your working memory into your long-term memory. Again, if you're getting a notification on your phone every 2 minutes, then that's going to take you out of the zone, and you're going to lose your train of thought, and you're not going to achieve the focus that you need. So pick a study environment, make it a place that you can set aside only for studying. If you don't have that in your house or at your apartment or whatever, come to the school, use the library, use the math lab, okay? And then put away anything that's going to distract you. The next thing I want to talk about is the Pomodoro Technique. So Pomodoro, I think, is an Italian word that means tomato, and basically it comes from the fact that whoever was the first person to kind of think of this method, had a little timer. It was like a kitchen timer, and it was in the shape of a tomato, right? So that's why this is called the Pomodoro Technique. But here's how it works, okay? When you're studying, you should time yourself and only study in about half-hour chunks. Okay, so you study for about 25 minutes and then you take a 5-minute break. Okay, after you've done that a few times, 3 or 4 times, so after you've studied for about a 2-hour period of time, then take a longer break. Take a 15 or 30-minute break. So let's say you have a big chunk of time, you have like 5 hours that you can set aside to study, do homework, etc. Right? It would be a very bad idea for you to just sit there and just work straight through for 5 straight hours. A much better thing to do would be to use this technique, time yourself, study for 25 minutes, take a 5-minute break. Study for 25 minutes, take a 5-minute break. After a couple of hours, take a longer break, like a 15 or 30-minute break. During your breaks, you need to physically get up and leave your study environment. That's because when you're on your break, you're probably going to be doing things that aren't studying. And your study environment needs to be a place where the only thing you do in that environment is study, right? So during your breaks, you need to physically get up and leave your study environment. Now, why would you want to do this? Okay, several reasons. Number one, this is going to help you to maintain motivation and to manage your distractions. Okay, so on the previous slide, when we were talking about your study environment, we said your study environment needs to be a place where all you do in that place is study, and you need to put away all distractions. For some of you, you might think, well, if I've got 5 hours of study time, I can't just put my phone away and not look at my phone for 5 hours, and so you leave your phone out so that you can check it. But if you use the Pomodoro technique, you can put your phone away, study for 25 minutes, and then during your 5-minute break, you can take your phone out and check your phone. Okay? So using the Pomodoro technique breaks it up into smaller chunks so that you can manage your distractions a little bit better. Second, this is pretty obvious, right? But this is gonna decrease your mental fatigue. If you'll take breaks every once in a while, then it's gonna decrease your mental fatigue so that you get more out of your study session, right? By taking breaks. It's sort of like the idea that if you get 8 hours of sleep at night, you're going to feel so much more mentally refreshed than if you got only 4 hours of sleep. And so staying up late to try to finish an assignment or something is a bad idea. It's better for you to get the rest and then complete the assignment when your brain is fresh, right? And so this is the same sort of thing. It's you're giving yourself breaks so that you don't get so fatigued. A third reason that you would want to use the Pomodoro technique is that it turns out that the things you remember most from your study sessions are the first thing you study and the last thing that you study. So if you've got like a 5-hour block of time to study and you just study straight through the whole thing, you're going to remember the first thing really well and the last thing really well. But if you take that same 5-hour chunk and you split it into half-hour sessions, then you've got a lot more firsts and lasts. And so you've got a lot more facts that you're going to have a better time recalling later on. And then the last reason that you'd want to implement the Pomodoro technique is that when you're resting, your brain will enter into what's called the diffuse mode of thinking. Whereas when you're studying, your brain is on the focused mode of thinking. Both modes of thinking are important. Okay, so if you just study for 5 hours straight without taking a break, then you're in the focused mode the entire time. The diffuse mode is being ignored in that scenario. And so you use the Pomodoro technique so that you're taking a break. When you're taking the break, you're not really thinking about whatever problem you were just working on, but your brain in the background is kind of running in the background. That's when your brain is in the diffuse mode. And so you might find if you are struggling with a problem, you get up, take a 5-minute break, and you focus on something else. And then when you come back 5 minutes later, this doesn't always work, but sometimes you might find the solution more simple to grasp because your brain was kind of running the problem in the background. This happened to me a lot in college. I would struggle with some kind of homework assignment, and then I would go to sleep, wake up the next day, and suddenly a solution would present itself, right? So anyway, so you want to give yourself breaks so that your brain has the chance to enter this diffuse mode of thinking. Okay, so we've talked about environment, So setting up a study environment, and then we've talked about the Pomodoro Technique, which is basically just timing yourself and giving yourself breaks. The next thing I want to talk about is active recall. So to contrast active recall with what people usually do, which is passive review, here's an example, right? So if you were studying for a history class and you needed to know about George Washington, reading about George Washington would be a passive review activity, whereas asking yourself what you already know about George Washington would be an active recall activity. We want to try to get into the active recall realm as much as possible. That's where learning takes place, right? Is when you're trying to actively recall what you know. So a lot of times we'll spend time reading, reviewing notes and things. Those things are necessary, but you've got to couple it with some active review. So here are some ways that you can practice active review. First of all, you could use flashcards. Tiny cards, this is an old thing that I used to use, and it doesn't exist anymore. It was an app, but it doesn't exist anymore. But there are other flashcard apps that you could use. Okay, so look up a flashcard app and use flashcards. Flashcards are great. Yeah, they're a great way to commit things to memory. They are an active recall technique because you look at one side of the card and you have to try to remember. You have to try to force your brain to remember what's on the other side. So this is an active recall thing. It's much better than just reading through your notes. Another active recall technique is read, recite, review, or SQ3R. You may have heard as this referred to in the past. I'm not going to get into a ton of detail with that, but you're welcome to Google it, SQ3R, and maybe get some insight from whatever you look up there. What I will say is this. If you're going to be reading through your notes, again, that's fine, but you need to couple it with some active recall. And so a better thing to do, rather than just, let's say you have 5 pages of notes that you want to read through, rather than just reading through all 5 pages, what you could do is read through half of a page and then look away from the page and try to just remember what you just read. Just doing that, right, is an active recall technique, and that's going to help the information actually sink in better, right? So you read half a page and then think about what you read. Try to summarize what you just read. And then read the next half of the page, summarize it again. That's going to be a much more effective thing to do than just reading through the notes. And it's going to take you longer, but you're going to know the information better. It would be better to do that, to use the active recall, than it would be to read through the notes 10 times, right? So use active recall. Another thing you could do is the Feynman technique, and here I have a link. I'll post these slides wherever I post the video, so you can follow this link and watch this video about the Feynman technique. Basically, the Feynman technique just means teach someone else the concept that you're trying to learn. You never learn better than when you're teaching someone else. So try to teach someone else the concept that you're learning, and that'll help you. That's a great active recall technique. Now, all of these things, all of these pieces of advice are good pieces of advice just for general studying. In math class, though, we do sometimes review notes and things like that, especially if you're preparing for a test. But that's actually not where most of the study takes place in a math class. In a math class, most of the study takes place when you're doing your homework assignments, right? So here's how you can practice active recall when you're doing homework problems. My advice is don't just bulldoze your way through the problem, okay? Try to understand it. Try to understand the problems, okay? You should consult your tutors and your notes and your textbook as little as possible. Now, I'm not saying don't get help from a tutor. What I am saying is that you should read through a homework problem, and then instead of just immediately raising your hand to get help from a tutor because you didn't understand the problem, put forth a sincere effort to understand what the problem is asking, and try to attack the problem yourself before you get help from a tutor. Same thing goes for your notes. Read, if you're working on a homework problem, read through the problem, attempt the problem before you look at your notes. A lot of times students will just have their notes out open in front of them while they're working on their homework, and they'll try to find a problem in the notes that's similar to the homework problem they're supposed to do, and then they'll try to copy it step by step, step by step, step by step, and that is not an effective way to learn. On a test or a quiz, you're not going to have your notes out in front of you, so you won't have that prop. And the reason I don't allow notes is because I want you to know the information, right? I want it to get into your brain. So a much better thing to do would be try the problem without looking at your notes. If you have to look at your notes, then that's fine, okay? But your goal should be to try to get through the homework set eventually without having to consult your notes at all. And then, if you do have to get help from a tutor, or if you do have to consult your notes in order to complete a problem, then I would say put a little star next to that problem, and when you've finished the homework set, come back to those problems and make sure that you understand how to do them on your own, without looking at your notes, without getting help from a tutor, right? The idea is that you want to understand your homework problems. You don't just want to finish all the problems, you want to actually understand them, okay? Okay, so that's active recall. So we've talked about learning environment, we've talked about Pomodoro techniques, we've talked about active recall. Last thing is spaced repetition. And this one, I'll just say quickly. Spaced repetition is the idea that you learn better if you gradually increase the amount of time between reviewing a concept. So when you're first learning a concept, you're going to spend a lot of time reviewing it. But then once you've kind of learned it, then you take a couple days off and review it. And then maybe you take a week off and review it again. And then maybe you take a couple weeks off and review it again. This is spaced repetition. This spaced repetition is pretty hard to implement on your own. The good news is this. If you're staying current with your homework assignments, most textbook authors try to put spaced repetition into the homework problems. And so you might notice that, right? You might come across a homework problem in chapter 6, and it's asking you something that we haven't talked about since back in chapter 2. That's because they're trying to help you with the spaced repetition to get you to learn the material. Now, if you wait until the day before the test to do all of the homework, you're not going to get the spaced repetition, okay? And which means you're not going to learn as effectively. So the moral of the story is you've got to stay on top of your homework, okay? Which brings me to our summary, right? So as you've kind of put together, I'm sure, a lot of what I've said comes down to you've got to stay current with your homework assignments, okay? You cannot wait until the last minute to do all of your homework assignments. My advice would be get the homework assignment done as soon as possible after the class that we've covered that material, right? So if we're going to go over 3.4 in class, and we cover 3.4 on Tuesday or whatever, your goal should be to go home and do the 2.4 homework on Tuesday. Now, for some of you, that's not going to be possible, right? You have other obligations, and you're not going to be able to get to the homework that same day. Okay, that's fine. Try to get to it as soon as you possibly can. At the very latest, get it done over the weekend so that you're ready for the new material in the coming week. Don't let any more than 1 week pass between the time that we cover the material in class and the time that you do the homework assignment. You need to stay current with your homework assignments. Okay. Now, as you're doing those homework assignments, make sure that you're using effective study techniques. And again, we talked about study environment. Make sure you have a study environment that's set apart only for studying. Use the Pomodoro technique. That means you time yourself, give yourself a break every half hour. Okay. Use active recall. So when you're doing the homework problems, don't just sit out there with your notes right next to you and do every single problem. Try to do the problems without looking at your notes. Only refer back to your notes if you need to. And if you had to refer back to your notes in order to complete a problem, go back to that problem later and make sure that you understand how to do it without looking at your notes. Same thing goes for getting help from a tutor. And then finally, spaced repetition. If you're staying on top of your homework in a timely manner, then the spaced repetition will take care of itself. So I want to end this discussion just by giving you like a brief example of what a good study strategy might look like. And You might come up with a different study strategy that looks a little different, and that's fine. Okay, but here's an example of a good strategy. What I think would be a good strategy. So step 1, you're going to go to class and you're going to take notes. Step 2, as soon as I can after class, I'm going to go through my notes and I'm going to try to summarize them. You don't necessarily have to make a written summary, but do what I was saying before with the active recall. You read like half the page and then look away, try to summarize it. Read half the page, look away, try to summarize it, okay? But as soon as you can after class, go through your notes, try to summarize them. Once you've gone through your notes and once you feel like you understand the material that's in your notes, then attempt the homework problems and try to do them without looking at your notes. Try to do them with just the information that's in your brain. If you have to look up something, try to use some recall techniques, flashcards, whatever, to try to commit whatever it is that you looked up to memory. And that way, as you move through the problem, as you move to the next problem, hopefully you won't have to look at your notes for the next one, because now that information is in your brain already. If you had to get help from a tutor to solve a problem, or if you had to look up something in your notes or the textbook in order to solve a problem, then revisit that problem again after you've finished the homework assignment to make sure that you've got the idea. And if you still can't do it, well, then revisit it again. Keep doing it again and again until you're sure that you understand every problem in the homework assignment. And then once you're finished with your homework, I would say you could go back through the summary that you made of the notes in part 2. This would be if you made like a written summary. You could go back through your written summary of the notes and see if you can improve it. See if there was any misconceptions in your original summary. Or see if there's anything that you could take out of the summary that turned out to be not so important, or something that you could add into the summary that was important that maybe wasn't quite as clear to you to begin with. All right. And of course, ideally, as you're going through these steps, you would be in your ideal study location, where all you do in that location is study. You would be timing yourself with the Pomodoro Technique. Okay. So that would be a good study strategy. I would say if you implemented this strategy or something similar to it, I can pretty much guarantee you're going to pass the class. In fact, I'd be willing to bet that you could get like an A in the class, or like a B at the worst, if you were to implement these strategies and take this seriously. So that's my advice as far as study strategies go. I will mention that we've talked about growth mindset. One of the things that we talked about with ways to develop growth mindset is to convince yourself that you really are in control of your abilities. And so these techniques, if you implement them, I promise you they will help you to be in control of your abilities, okay? And that will help you to obtain more of a growth mindset. The other thing that I'll mention is that we're going to be taking later on in this semester, we're going to be taking a growth mindset course. And then once we've completed that, we're going to be taking a learning how to learn course, which is basically a study skills course. So these things will come back later on in the semester as well. In the meantime, please review this as needed. If you find yourself struggling and you're looking for study advice or whatever, you can get help from a bunch of different sources, but use this one as well. You can come back, rewatch this video, go through the slides, try to think of new ideas to help you study. So with that, I think that's all I have to say for now about study skills. We'll talk to you later.